Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society's History Group. The History Group functions as a monthly event to share current research related to Barbadian, Caribbean, and diasporic history, heritage, and culture. And we are proud to host a number of incredible scholars from across many regions and disciplines. Our format today will include a presentation, followed by a Q&A session with the audience, where you can share your comments and questions. If you're joining us on Zoom, please submit your questions to the Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen. We're also live streaming on Facebook. For our viewers there, please submit your questions in the comment section of the video and they will be relayed here. I am very pleased to introduce our speakers, Professor Judith A. Byfield and Professor Itotan I. Osayemwese, who will be sharing their research on Barbadian women immigrants in Nigeria in the period 1950 to 1990. Judith Byfield is a professor of history at Cornell University. The primary focus of her scholarship has been women's social and economic history in Nigeria. She has completed in-depth studies on tie-dye production, World War II, Nigerian women's political activism and nationalism. Currently, she is a Fulbright Global Scholar beginning a new project, Curry Goat and Gari, West Indian Women in 20th Century Lagosian Society. Itotan I. Osayemwese is an Associate Professor of the History of Art and Architecture and Associate Professor of Urban Studies at Brown University. Her research engages with theories of modernity, post-colonialism, and globalization to analyze built environments in 19th and 20th century West Africa, the Anglo-Caribbean, and Germany. Her current research explores migration, property and emancipation in the Anglo-Caribbean, the problem of translation in the historiography of African architecture, and global histories of race and architecture. Welcome, Judith and Itotan.
Okay, I should go ahead now? Okay. Thank you so much for inviting us to participate in this event. And also, I have to say a special thank you to Ito, who asked me to participate today, and we share a similar interest in West Indian women, and also specifically West Indian women in Nigeria. And we're part of a small intellectual community that share that interest. And so it's really been just a rich experience for me, being able to learn from Ito at the same time. I wanted to start off by giving you just a little bit of background in how I came to this topic and what I'm hoping to get out of this project. So I was born in Jamaica, did primary school there. My parents, my father in particular, had a very extensive music collection. And I think it wasn't unusual, that in the Caribbean, people listen to a wide range of music. So we had country, Western, Perry Como, as well as Miriam Makeba. And so I cite that because I think, it was a part of growing up, knowing something about Africa, but certainly listening to African musicians. My interest in Africa really developed in college, and I took courses on African literature, art history, but it was really when I decided to go to graduate school that I focused in on Africa. And specifically, I was interested in Nigeria, partly because one of the authors that who I read a lot of in college was Chinua Achebe. And so that inspired this interest, but it was very, very vague. First semester in grad school, when they said, well, what are you going to write on? All I could say was women and nationalism in Nigeria. And, I had to get a little bit more specific. And one of my professors, Hollis Lynch, who's actually from Trinidad, suggested that I write about Jamaicans in Nigeria. And I said, no, I'm not going to go to Nigeria to write about Jamaicans. But he was the one who also introduced me to Fumilayo Ransom Kuti, who was Fela's mother. And, and she she fit well into those large categories that I had: women, nationalism, Nigeria, a really important person. And so I started going to Nigeria in 1985. And I was there first for 3 months, and then I went back in 1988, and I was there for 11 months. In the process, when I went back in 88, I met Lorraine Animashaun, who actually is she's married. We're related through marriage. Her uncle is married to my great aunt. She told me, my home in Lagos was her home. And I was living with Nigerian families in Abeokuta and in Ibadan. Abeokuta is a town that most of my research has focused on, but I've been attached to the history department at University of Ibadan. And so I had this great experience that year moving between or among these three cities. And then when I would visit Lorraine, one of the things that for me was sort of really poignant was that I felt like I was almost living in two different cultural zones. So with the Nigerian families I lived with, I was eating gari and eba, and then I go to Lorraine and we're eating curry chicken and rice and peas. Through Lorraine, I went to a wedding. Our husband's nephew got married and did Ashoebi with the West Indian women who were her friends in Lagos. I went to the Niger Wives Conference that year and also went to West Indian Carnival. And so I was living, with one foot, in a sense, in that experience, in that moment. Michael Manley also came to Nigeria that year. And I remember all of these women came, and it was just incredible being around them and seeing Michael Manley in Nigeria. I then went on to write 2 books focusing specifically on Nigeria and specifically on Abeokuta. So the first one, The Bluest Hands, looked at the indigo tie-dyeing industry in Abeokuta. And this town was especially well known for their tie-dyeing industry, really the center of tie-dye production. And then the second book, The Great Upheaval, focused on the tax revolt that Mrs. Ransom Kuti led in 1947. And that was how I ended up also working on World War II. I had to understand the impact of the war on then this tax revolt in the post-war period. And so as that second book was, in press, I started to think about what would be my next project. And I actually had been nursing 2 ideas. One was to do a book about my parents, our migration to the US. Both my parents worked in a textile factory in Kingston. And so we were part of that late 60s migration, a number of other...
Low battery.
Oh, sorry.
Low battery.
Sorry about that. A number of other textile workers came at the same time. And so that was one thought. But the other thought that kept rolling around was, writing about those West Indian women I had hung out with. And also, I was teaching a course on marriage and divorce in Africa. And there is a lot of literature that's come out somewhat fairly recent, at least in the last 3 decades, that talks a lot about interracial marriage, but very little literature that looks at African diasporic women married to Nigerians. So as in the midst of teaching that course, I was also very conscious of this gap in the literature. And it was really that course that helped me decide that I would do the Nigerian project first, the West Indian women in Nigeria first. And my hope through this project for this project is that I want to intervene in several different sort of literatures and discussions that are going on at this time. There's been a tremendous amount of work being done on the formation of the African diaspora, on Pan-Africanism, as well as on migration and things like transnational studies. transnational families. However, much of the discussion on Pan-Africanism and even the African diaspora does not pay attention to the role of women, or specifically West Indian women. We're beginning to see some books now, for example, that have talked about women in the UNIA, for example, women like Esmond Paul Robeson's wife, and I'm messing up her first name there, I'm sorry about that, but also Shirley Du Bois. So women who were part of sort of doing the intellectual work of crafting what the African diaspora was, of crafting ideas around Pan-Africanism and bringing a specific gender dimension to that conversation. We're also seeing an increasing attention to transnational studies, but more specifically transnational migration, transnational families, because as the pace of migration has picked up, we have so many people now who are coming from different parts of the world, they're not migrants in the sense that they leave one place and go to another place and then cut off sort of relationships with the places at home. They're actually maintaining these different connections to different parts of the world. And they do that through a number of things, just as simple as phoning and staying in touch, sending money back home, but also through the cultural practices that they do within their house, the foods that they eat. And so even though Caribbean migration is among the greatest in the world, and Caribbean families are an important component of transnational families, those Caribbean women who are in Africa, as opposed to the UK or Canada or the US, don't really exist in the literature. And so this project gives me an opportunity to think about, well, how did Caribbean women create these West Indian, Nigerian transnational families? What does that tell us today about how people maintain identities across these disparate areas? How do they connect their families? And in fact, what are the benefits, but also some of the challenges of being a part of transnational families in this moment where migration is so ubiquitous in so many societies, where we're so interconnected at the global level? And so their stories are important to me. And this is partly what I've been doing with gathering interviews with different people, just learning how they navigated going from one society to another. For many of these women, it was actually 3 societies, because they had gone to London or Canada, met their husbands there, going to Nigeria. And so this work, for me, I see it as something that can be transformative in the scholarship that is created around transnationalism, around the African diaspora, and the role of women in shaping those processes. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Judy. I think you've laid a very good foundation for what I would like to talk about. So I'm going to start with an anecdote, and I'm actually going to show some slides to go along with my brief presentation. Let's see, hopefully you can see my slides. Can everyone see my slides? Yes, okay. So just to give a little bit of geographic context to what Judy just shared with us, her trajectory toward this project. Here I'm just showing you a map of Nigeria in 1967. The distribution of states has changed significantly since then, but at that point there were 12 states in Nigeria, and I'm showing you some of the major cities in which West Indian women were settling and establishing lives and raising families, including Lagos, Ibadan, Benin, and to the east, Enugu, and other cities as well. So that gives you just a little bit of a geographical context. So I'm going to start with a brief anecdote. In 2017, I met a Nigerian colleague who was visiting my university, Brown University. And when I mentioned that my mother was from Barbados and my father Nigerian, she grew really excited. And she shared with me that her mother, who was a Yoruba woman from Lagos, had regularly mentioned how much she admired West Indian women married to Nigerian men. And she specifically admired them because of the ways in which they kept their houses and raised their children. Now, I was already working on a project about Barbadian migration, but that project was about and is about 19th century and early 20th century migration of Barbadian men, women, and families to Panama, to Brazil, Cuba, Venezuela, United States, and so on. And I was interested in the impact of those population movements on property ownership back in Barbados, as well as on building styles and building use. But my colleagues' excitement and her comment drew my attention to another phase of Barbadian migration, one in which I was deeply embedded in on a personal level. And so, as we are wont to do, I put on my thinking cap, so to speak, and I started asking questions. So I wanted to know, who were these West Indian women? Why and how did they come to be in Nigeria? And what was the West Indian woman's home like? And how was it different or similar to Nigerian homes? And what was the significance of such differences? And I was certainly aware from my own personal experiences growing up that Barbadian women were a subset of a larger community of West Indian women in Nigeria. And so my research was about Barbadian women, but it was also more broadly about West Indian women. Let's see if I can get my slides to progress. There we go. Okay. And so to answer these questions, I started, like Judith, recording oral histories of West Indian women in Nigeria. I started collecting photographs and trying to document their homes and their environments. And this is a shameless request for more photographs. I'm still collecting photographs. So if you think you have any material that could help me with my project, I will share my email and you can please share that material with me. And I also started to try to find scholarly literature on this topic. And I rapidly came to realize that, there was very little, as Judith has mentioned. There was a little bit of work that had been done on West Indians in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in South Africa, Ghana, and Nigeria. But specifically earlier in the 20th century. And within this scholarship, women's voices were really not very, very present. There has been one scholar really who has talked about West Indian women in Nigeria in the early 20th century, and she focused on folks like Amy Ashwood Garvey, who I'm showing here on the screen, who came to Nigeria in 1947 after several decades of sort of communications and correspondence with folks in Ghana and Nigeria. She finally came in 1947, but there were others like Dahlia Whitburn, who was a Jamaican physician who came to Nigeria in 1928 and worked there briefly. A Grenadian journalist, Henrietta Millicent Douglas, who came to Nigeria in 1939. So there were others. But my own focus has been really on the West Indian women who migrated to Nigeria in in the 1970s. And here I'm showing you a sort of a map of Nigeria, showing you the proliferation of states, just to kind of bring you up to date geographically. So my interest has been on women who were living particularly in what used to be the Midwestern and Eastern regions of the country. And so in cities like Benin City, which is kind of showing you here on the lower left, in cities in Abia State and Delta states, and especially in the 1970s. Like their sisters in Lagos and Ibadan, which Dr. Judith Byfield has focused her research on. These women were professionals. They had been trained often in Canada, England, the United States as nurses, school teachers, librarians, university professors, and they brought those professions with them when they came to Nigeria. But even as they were pursuing these professional careers, many of them, they also built a strong community outside of work. And this community, again, was created around shared countries of origin, similar experiences, common values. And in my research, it became clear that the home and the garden were the loci of some of this kind of group and identity building. So let's talk about the garden a little bit. I'm sure you can imagine where this is headed. West Indian women in Nigeria, like West Indian women in the West Indies, were devoted to their gardens, where many Nigerian-only households focused exclusively on raising foodstuffs in farms, either at their homes or in the peripheries, suburban villages. West Indian women grew foodstuffs in kitchen gardens and on larger farms as well, but they also created ornamental gardens. And I think this is one of the major kind of distinguishing characteristics. They raised beautiful ferns, anthuriums, roses, orchids, coxcombs, zinnias, bougainvillea, hibiscus, crotons, pride of Barbados, and many other species in ceramic pots, in old milk cans, and anything they could sort of lay their hands on, in buckets, in raised beds, and in the ground. Now, growing plants for pleasure was not widespread in Nigeria at this time. And so arguably these gardens marked West Indians as different from Nigerians. In addition, gardens functioned as opportunities for sociability. So West Indian women visited with each other in the evenings and on weekends, and they would strategize about where to source new plants, where to, they would share cuttings, discuss how to propagate different plants, and show off their latest successes in the gardens. Some took courses, some attended conferences, and some started commercial establishments, nurseries, and flower arranging businesses as a way to supplement their incomes in a depressed economy in 1970s and 1980s Nigeria. But beyond their potential financial function and the pleasure that they provided, ornamental gardening linked West Indian women to each other and to their islands of origin. I'm showing you here a painting by the well-known, recently late Barbadian British painter, Jill Walker, showing you, it's called Tending Her Plants. So it's a chattel house in Barbados, and it shows plants in pots and in the ground, and an older lady, watering her garden. And this is something that was present in the backgrounds of women from Barbados, as well as from other islands. Several of the women I interviewed said that back home in Barbados, in Antigua, wherever they came from, there were always a few potted plants on the veranda or in the yard where they were growing up. Now, one thing that is particularly interesting to me is that archaeological research has actually shown that this practice of ornamental gardening that is so widespread among West Indian women in Nigeria, in the West Indies as well, and in the United States and elsewhere in the diaspora that they've gone, actually dates to at least the 18th century, if not before, when we have enslaved African women, and there's evidence for this in Antigua, Barbados, and Jamaica, growing not only food, but also ornamental plants in their provision grounds and in the slave yard. So this, to me, you know, when I first encountered this piece of scholarship, it really kind of helped me understand the trajectory and the history of this, you know, this practice. In an essay reflecting on the distinctive, joyous, and chaotic West Indian approach to gardening, the very well-known Antiguan American writer, Jamaica Kincaid, speculates that a group of people who have had such horrible historical association with growing things would try to create a new relationship to agriculture that is more dignified. And this is what, this to her is the explanation for this West Indian approach to gardening. For her, gardening, and she apparently has a garden, she grows a garden in Vermont, and, you know, sort of very cold New England part of the United States. She grows a garden that's very much in this tradition, and she's explained it as an exercise of memory, a way of getting to a past that is her past, but also the past that was directly related to her, the colonial past, the history of enslavement. Excuse me. So apart from the garden, West Indian women's houses in Nigeria were also a marker of identity. So there were shared patterns of use in the use of the house and in the interior decoration of the house, especially in terms of the sitting room and the kitchen. I'm going to just say a few words very briefly about the sitting room, but I'm not going to be able to talk about the kitchen. So the West Indian woman's sitting room often had up-to-date furniture sets that the woman had shipped from England, Canada, or the United States when they first arrived, or imported on a later trip. This was a pattern that I encountered in my interviews. Western style furniture was not unusual in Nigeria. There are several traditions of Western style furniture, you know, preceding the arrival of West Indians, certainly, and preceding the arrival of the British, really, such as this 19th century style of furniture that was created by formerly enslaved Africans who had returned to Nigeria, often forcibly been sent back to Nigeria from Brazil in the 19th century. Many of them were craftspeople, they were carpenters, and they knew how to create, you know, Brazilian style, Western style objects. And so there's a whole tradition of this kind of furniture. So Western style furniture was not, you know, unusual in Nigeria. But what may have been unusual was this idea of, you know, importing entire sets of furniture rather than buying furniture, Western style furniture, from local shops like Leventis or Kingsway or other stores in Nigeria. Also distinctive was the way in which West Indian women arranged their sitting rooms. According to some of my interviewees, the typical Nigerian sitting room had a few pieces of furniture pushed against the walls, creating a very large, empty, open space at the core of the sitting room. And in fact, when we look at this historically, we know that Nigerian cultural groups have specific rules that govern social relations and social interactions. And these rules arguably necessitate a more expansive and less intimate sort of spatial configuration in the interior, in interior spaces like sitting rooms. One scholar who looked at this kind of transformations in Nigerian houses from the 1940s to the 1980s noted that in the Yoruba-speaking parts of Nigeria, very large sitting rooms had replaced the older tradition of open courtyards where guests were received. So by the 1940s, we start to see these large, open, empty kind of sitting areas that the West Indian women that I interviewed would later comment on. This scholar also argued that Yoruba people were invested in making their parlors fine. So that's to use, Nigerian parlance, making their parlors fine by furnishing them with carved chairs, tables, a linoleum floor, a rug, or decorating the walls with family photographs and pictures cut out from magazines. So in fact, Nigerians did have this kind of investment in their sitting rooms or parlors. It was just a different kind of investment from West Indian women who took a different approach to outfitting their sitting rooms. And so the image I'm showing you right here is a West Indian front room from England in the 1960s. And there's been a little bit of scholarship talking about the particular and maybe peculiar ways in which the West Indian front room, which is essentially the sitting room, was developed in England and Britain, I should say, by the Windrush generation starting in the 1950s. It had certain characteristic elements like the paraffin heater, the radiogram, the drinks trolley, the dolls that were, clothed with crocheted dresses, crochet doilies that, sort of, as you see here in this image, placed on the coffee table, artificial flowers, curtains, the plastic covered settee, and so on. And so this front room in England in this period was used only on special occasions, and it was maintained carefully in between. The argument is that West Indian immigrants in England lavished attention on this space in order to perform a kind of respectability that they were not able to embody in public space. So in their private space, in this colonial, racist, and anti-immigrant, environment they were in England, they could put on this mantle of middle-class respectability that they so aspired to. Now, it seems from my interviews that West Indian women in Nigeria built on this practice that was already in place in Britain. They conceived their sitting rooms as integrated units with couches, chairs, side tables, and coffee tables placed in close proximity to each other to facilitate conviviality. And these spaces were spaces for visitors, but visiting happened much more frequently and was not attended by all the ceremony that would typically be attended with in other Nigerian households. I'm just going to briefly mention that while West Indian women in Nigeria continued some of the aspects of decoration that I sort of mentioned from the British context, the dolls with crochet dresses and so on, they also did something different. And we start to see the appearance of historical Nigerian arts and crafts in their homes, like this leather poof from the northern parts of the country, which appeared in many West Indian homes in Nigeria during this period. Ceramic pottery that was historically used for traditional Nigerian worship was converted into pottery for plants, right? And we have, other types of Nigerian arts and crafts that were really adopted by West Indian women as elements in their interior decoration. And by adopting these elements, they really contributed to a kind of renaissance in Nigerian local arts and crafts. So I'm going to stop here and say that really in my work, I'm interested in the way in which these gardens and homes contributed to helping West Indian women build, unique and distinctive identities and to differentiate themselves from, other Nigerian households. The question becomes, why would they have been interested in doing that? What purpose did that kind of differentiation serve? And that's still in my mind an open question. So with that, I would like to sort of invite our two panelists, Mrs. Osayemwese and Mrs. Kolmita Acha, to please, unmute themselves and, talk to Judith and I about your experiences as West Indian women and specifically Barbadian women in Nigeria. we can start with just kind of a general question. What surprised you most about Nigeria when you first arrived? What felt familiar? What was different from your expectation?
If I were to go first, what surprised me was that how essential, even before the word was in common parlance, how essential it was to network. I had to have a relationship with the butcher, a relationship with the baker, a relationship with everyone who would facilitate my survival in a new country. And I found you didn't walk into an office and present a form or ask a question. You had to be presented by someone, a brother, a sister. That was what surprised me.
And that would be particularly difficult for you, right? Because you have just, come to the country and didn't necessarily have those networks and relationships already in place.
Yeah, so I had to start from the bottom up. But by the time I left, I was as good a networker as anyone. Yes.
Well, I found the networking environment was essential, as Carmita said, to surviving. And you, through that network, you got information which is the best market to go to or to send. Where would you get good beef that was fresh, that was from the north, or where the yams were really good, but you had to go a certain day. So I found that was information that she's talking about the office, but I'm talking about the everyday things. I'm talking about plantains and yams. Where are you going to get the best buys at the best time? That was essential for you to feed your family and also to survive. So I found the West Indians had a lot, those I met often had their network. So it was, you joined that network until you figured out your own, right? There was a time, for instance, when flour as to make bread was very scarce. Okay, so you got 4 friends or 3 friends, and you decided that you were going to buy a bag of flour, a whole, 40 pounds or whatever?
50 kilos.
All right. And you said, in my case, my beloved husband would go to pick it up for me, but I would be there because I couldn't carry that amount. And I would come home, and the same network, the 4 friends and yourselves, you would share it out in your veranda or your sitting room, bowl. Me, you, Kalmita, Itohan, whoever, we will share it out. And then your friends will come and pick up their share. And that was really a networking something. The same thing happened with cattle from the north. Nigerians ate a lot of beef, at least, in a certain level, and you killed, you got an animal killed, which you shared with 12 people. So you had to have some contact with the butcher. You had to have some contact with where the animals came into the country. And then usually it was the men who went to the slaughtering place. I've never gone there. And they came back with a bucket. You carried your own bucket, and you came back with a bucket of meat from all parts of that cow. And that was truly, so even the men were forced to be active in this networking triangle to feed their children. So that was really surprising. I mean, which market, where, when, and then flour. So that was one of the things that I found surprised me much later. When I first got to Nigeria, it was after the war, and things were looking up. You could actually go to to Levante's or Kingsway. Those were the 2 large stores, and you could get most things that you would get in England. Of course, they were very expensive, but you could go and get Dove or something that you wouldn't get in the local market. So that was similar to what you were accustomed to. But the surprising thing was, as Collie said, you needed that network in order to survive.
Yes, I remember Auntie Irma. In my first year or two in Benin City, I would just go to Leventis, do all my shopping, Kingsway. And then one day, I met Irma in the shop and she said to me, "You have to stop this. You're wasting your money. I will take you to the market." I was terrified because you don't ask how much is this and hand over the money, you have to haggle. And that terrified me. I was a very retiring person. I could not bring myself to haggle. But she says, "You have to do it." And she took me. Then another friend took me and said, "This is how you buy meat." And the fear just, gradually waned. And I learned to shop in the market and save a bundle. And you got and you could walk past and you shout, "Customer, are you walking past without buying something?" Yeah, so that when what we're going through in England right now, I tell my children, I'm well prepared because I lived in Nigeria in the 70s and the 80s when there was a recession and there was Operation Tighten Your Belt. Various items were not landing in the country. You had to improvise. I remember ladies making bread out of cassava when flour was scarce. And people, I think some people there was a kind of yogurt train. Somebody would do a start and pass it on, and all the families could make their own yogurt. But you just had to depend on each other to know where, as Denise says, where you could get a particular item. I personally was never desperately out of, there was a shortage of rice, but I was never short on rice because like I had a friend in this shop who would tell me, "This shop, they've got rice now." And you would run down to that shop before it finished. And then you could get another one. Yes. But it was a steep learning curve, I have to say.
It was. And speaking of improvising, to this day, some people still ask me about my gari cake. In Barbados, we'd make a cassava pone, right?
Yes.
Fresh cassava, you could get the coconut and everything. But in Nigeria then, well, I would get gari and I would soak it. I would put some milk and some water and put everything else in it and bake it like I would bake pone at home. It wasn't quite as soft, but all my children ate it and all my friends ate it. And my in-laws used to call it the gari cake.
Yes.
Gari cake. Then, I want to make cornbread. Well, then in that case, we go to the market and we buy the corn kernels, And then you go to the next stall and you have them ground. And you won't want it ground only once, you want it ground about 3 times so that it would be fine enough. And then when you come home, it's still warm from this grinding action. So when you come home, you spread it out on something on the table, the floor, or whatever to cool it because you don't want to put it away warm. But
Judith, do you want to move to another question? Or...
Yeah, that's good.
Go ahead, Judith.
So one of the things I was curious about too is, did you have an interest in Africa before you moved to Nigeria? Did you grow up in your household talking about it, or were you politically engaged
sorry.
before going to Nigeria?
I have to say that in retrospect, I didn't have the words or the thoughts for what I feel now. But after school, my friends and I would go off to the Barbados Public Library. We would borrow fiction books to take home, but we would also go to the nonfiction and look through these big books. And invariably they contained pictures of, you would come across pictures of African children who would invariably be nude, shaven-headed. At Sunday school, you'd be asked to bring your pennies to put in the envelopes for the missionaries for the poor children in Africa. And I feel that my parents and grandparents' generations had a selective amnesia about the past. Our history was not mentioned, at least in my house. I don't know about Denise, but nobody talked about slavery. Occasionally you'd hear the adults' conversation refer to the time of the riots, but you never knew what were the riots? What is a riot? You were never given that information. Nobody ever used the word slave. But I was very lucky to have a teacher. She was English, Mrs. Tudor. And we were supposed to do O-level history, two English papers, the Tudors and Stuarts, and then the Hanoverians. But Mrs. Tudor wanted to mix it up, and she said, it coincided with the publication of the first book of Caribbean history by the University of Jamaica professors O.J. Gordon Hall and Record. And in that book was the first time that we came across the triangular trade. And it's ironic that it was an English woman who made us, who were products of this trade, to become more aware of our history. And that was, for me, that was the beginning. But then I traveled for my university, and for some reason, I was housed on the floor with African students on one side and English on the other. And we became very friendly, and going to lectures, you met other African students. So that was going to university was my first opportunity to meet an African person not of a diaspora. So yes, I had a little bit of prior before going to Nigeria, but I was married and my family was complete when I arrived in Nigeria. So in that gap, I started reading. My brother had introduced me to Caribbean writers, also not on our syllabus. But in the time I was married, I read and read and read fiction, nonfiction. And then I had the pleasure to teach some of it in my English lessons. So I did have a lead up, but nothing prepares you for being there and having to live there.
Well, my experience was very similar to Colmita's. We went to similar schools. We
went to the same
went to
schools.
the same exact schools, so we are exposed to the same exact teachers. But one of my sixth form history teachers, she was the one who was teaching us Caribbean history. And in doing Caribbean history, then we got more exposure to the triangular trade. But earlier, as Colmita said, all the children were naked, they were hungry, etc., etc. But that was then. But even as a teacher here, I have had kids ask me, do they live in trees? Do they have cars? What kind of houses did they have in Lagos? and they still find it hard to believe or to understand. I'm talking about 4 years ago, that Africa has some very, very modern parts. And yes, getting to university, you join the International Association, Students Association, which is invariably 70% African anyway, 70% would be Nigerians, lots of Nigerians. It was international, but there were a few of this and a few of that, but it was dominated by Africans. So you got to learn a lot about them as you were reading about them and about their culture, what they ate, what they did, etc. Yeah.
Thank you. Perhaps we should ask if there are any questions from the audience that we might discuss.
Tahan, we don't have any questions coming through in the Q&A, so I do encourage everyone again to submit any questions or comments you may have there in the chat. But I do have a question, if I may submit it to everyone in the panel. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the illuminating presentation and discussion. A lot of really important points, in the wider Caribbean history that we often don't discuss. My question is, when we look at the Windrush generation and that migration, we discuss both the Caribbean impact in the UK, but also the legacies in the Caribbean itself through things like remittance, repatriation, and a shifting of a cultural identity to a very particular hybridized Caribbean identity. And so I wanted to ask if you can share what you think some of the legacies of this migration to Nigeria in the period you're looking at are for the Caribbean region, for extended families or intergenerational experiences, or are these yet to be determined from what you found?
That's a great question. And I'll just say briefly that I think you are looking at the sort of impact right now. Certainly the impact, it's difficult to quantify or to quantify and figure out the extent of the impact. And I don't think we can compare. We're certainly not at the point where we can talk about an internal transformation in Barbados or any other island as a result of these women migrating, some spending half of their lives, some all of their lives, in Nigeria or elsewhere. But I will say that, anecdotally, I do believe that there's actually quite a significant population of younger generation West Indians or folks who have a diasporic identity that is half West Indian and half West African, to put it, mildly. And I think no one has really kind of tapped into that identity and that community and what their impact both on the islands and in Nigeria or other West African countries has been. I think it's a potential field for kind of exploration. That's what I'll say. I think Judith has some thoughts on that.
Yes. So one of the things that's happened as a result of and this is one of the things that some of the women I interviewed stressed to me, was that the 90s was a particularly 80s and 90s was a particularly difficult period in Nigeria. And so a number of women left Nigeria at that point. And for some of those who returned to the UK, one of the things they did, and Lorraine Animashaun was a really important person in this, they started a Nigerian West Indian Association in the UK. And part of what they do there really is to maintain and continue to nurture this sort of hybrid identity, where you have this generation now that are very self-consciously West Indian and Nigerian, but they're also part of a larger cosmopolitan group that is very comfortable in all of these different settings. It also means, and here I think one of the things I realize I need to talk about in my book too is the whole issue with passports and what it, the difficulties it has posed, but also the options that the fact that their mothers are not from Nigeria has created for some of the members of this community. And so having access to a passport from Trinidad or Jamaica or the UK or Canada gives them a certain mobility that is not quite the same for than people who are traveling on a Nigerian passport or other passports. One of the other things that I think is important to pay attention to, and Ito is absolutely right, that we don't have enough information about this as yet, but I mean, you literally have some people who are living a part of their life in the region and in Nigeria. So there was one person I interviewed, for example, who trained as a doctor, but became a baker and has bakeries in Lagos, but lives a part of the year in Barbados. His mother is from Barbados, and actually his father had also spent time in Barbados before they all moved to Nigeria. But for him, it's been really important that his children are grounded in both cultures. I did speak to one woman who was very, very upset at her father. Her father is Yoruba. No, sorry, I take it back. He's from the East. But, whereas she talked about the things at home that for her established this West Indian identity, she had never been to Jamaica, and that was where her mother was from. And so it was as an adult that she went to Jamaica and came back really angry at her father that he had never encouraged them to go to Jamaica before. You're also seeing a number of professional Nigerians who have moved to Jamaica. And so there are a number of nurses, for example, because there were nursing shortages in Jamaica as nurses were leaving to go to the UK or Canada and the US. And so at one point, there was a program that was bringing Nigerian nurses to the hospitals in Jamaica. But you've also seen people at the universities or in other areas from the continent living in the Caribbean. For some people, it's sort of part of a transit point where they're hoping to go from there to the US or to Canada. But for others, it's become a new home. And so I think there are a whole host of new connections that are being established between the West Indies and Nigeria that have been sort of below the surface. And part of the reason I think it's so important to begin to pay attention to some of that is because the literature in some ways still sort of builds on the idea that the relationship between the Caribbean and Africa was in the, from the 1400s up to the 19th century, and then it sort of stopped. And whereas part of what I see this work doing is showing that those relationships did not end with the transatlantic slave trade. And in fact, they continued. You certainly had people from the West Indies who in the 19th century were going to Africa as some who worked as missionaries, but you had a number of West Indians, in fact, who were really critical to the establishment of the railway in Nigeria, because when they started building the railway, they had, British engineers overseeing the whole thing, but they also needed a workforce that had some familiarity with this. And it was to the West Indies that they went. And so they were importing labor from Guyana, Jamaica, Trinidad, as well as Barbados to work on the railway. And I was remembered as the conversation came up about bread, Amos Shackelford, who was considered the bread king of Lagos, he was Jamaican, and he came over actually to work on the railway. And then once he left the railway, then started this bread manufacturing plant. And so there's more that needs to be written about those West Indians who came in the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, because they're really important, in fact, not just to the creation of the infrastructure in Nigeria, but someone like Shackelford, who was one of the co-founders of the first political party in Lagos, the National Nigerian Democratic Party, that he starts with Herbert Macaulay. But he falls through the cracks. And so there hasn't been enough attention to the contribution of the African diaspora to these to the whole development of sort of even intellectual thought and political life. Robert Campbell starts one of the first newspapers in Lagos in 1860, and he came over with Martin Delaney, and it was part of an effort to repatriate African Americans. They came to Abeokuta literally in 1859. Campbell wrote about that experience. Delaney wrote about it separately. But whereas Delaney returned to the US and remained in the US, Campbell moved back to Lagos and starts this newspaper in 1860. So if you're looking at, sort of the beginnings of that intellectual life, political culture, debates that are going on in Lagos, West Indians actually are a really important part of all of that, but they get left out of the literature. Yes, and it makes sense that people focus on, the Nigerians who were very critical to that, but I think we also have to recognize the important role that the diaspora played in the development of those ideas. And it helps us to see the continuity of the relationship between Africa and the Caribbean. It didn't end with the slave trade, and it doesn't, get rekindled by Bob Marley. It was constant.
Thank you, Judy. That was I think right on point. I do want to add that I think we cannot sort of discuss this question without alluding to a sense of anti-foreigner sentiment that is present, at least in Barbados, and certainly probably in some other island nations, anti-African sentiment specifically. And I would say that I think in thinking about, sort of the impact and awareness of that there is this community of, West Indian Nigerians in Barbados and in other countries, we really have to kind of take a moment to think about the way in which that anti-foreigner, anti-African sentiment has meant that maybe there isn't as much of a desire to kind of be public about this identity in some ways, although some of us, it's unavoidable from our names and so on. It's quite clear that we're African. So that, I think, is an important element of all of this. I wanted to refer to one of the questions in the chat. The question is about transnational identity born out of these exchanges. Do we see any manifestations of this hybrid identity in contemporary art or material culture? How are the artists interpreting and expressing this hybrid identity? I do think that, and again, the research hasn't been done yet, so this is something that's hopefully will come out of the kind of work that Judith and I are doing. I do think that there is a moment in the let's say 60s and 70s when the kind of a broader Pan-Africanist cultural shift that's happening affects certainly island nations and island cultures. And I think that the folks, the West Indians, women who were in Nigeria and other parts of West Africa, and who had had firsthand encounters with African culture and married African men or so on and so on, had something to contribute to the kind of I suppose growth of this Pan-African kind of cultural identity, the incorporation of actual authentic African, objects, clothing, arts and crafts that I mentioned in my presentation earlier is part of that. I think that, it certainly wasn't the only cause for Pan-Africanism growing in the islands, but I think it contributed to it. So the presence of women coming back to Barbados, visiting, wearing African clothes in some cases, having a different kind of knowledge about African culture that I think strengthened and really authenticated, Pan-African kind of cultural developments at that moment. I think that we can see that in, cultural forms like dress. We can see that perhaps in some fine arts as well. I don't think we see it really in architecture or in the built environment, but, I would be curious to learn more.
You also see a lot of it actually in music.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Magic Flashek. I mean,
Absolutely.
First time I heard him, I actually thought I was listening to Bob Marley.
That's great.
And then to see that, so reggae has really been popular. And I mean, I remember taking the train, and this is when the train was still functioning, from Ibadan to Kano. I was going to a conference up at Bayero, and the whole way up, every time we pulled into a station, somebody was playing reggae. And it just completely fascinated me how deeply integrated it had become. And then you get someone like Flashek, who's not just covering Bob Marley songs, but was singing reggae songs in Igbo. And so I think some really interesting work has been done by ethnomusicologists who are looking at how, sort of West Indian musical traditions and so many people they'll focus on rap and hip hop, but reggae in particular has been a really important tool among youth activists, also wearing dreadlocks. And so there's really good work that's being done in Senegal, for example, that's looking at the importance of Rastafarian ideas and how that's been incorporated into youth culture, but it's also a part of how they sort of position and express their resistance and their critique of the contemporary government in places like Senegal. So I think for me, music has really been the place where I've seen a lot of that sort of adoption and adaptation of West Indian cultural elements.
Great. Thank you so much, Judith and Idohan. And can I say, it really is a pleasure also to be hearing these migration stories firsthand from Denise and Colmetta. We do have a couple of questions now in the Q&A, so I'm going to read those out. The first one is from Janice, and it's to all of the panelists. And they ask, did you experience welcome? And did it meet your expectations or assumptions of what to expect on moving into Nigerian society?
Generally, I would say I was welcome, but
I was too.
Arriving after 13 or 14 years in England, I was often referred to as the Oyibo lady. And I found that very offensive. The word Oyibo refers to foreigner, British, white person, it covers all those. And I was annoyed that I couldn't be seen for who I was. And that only made me reinforce my Barbadian identity, because I am not going to be seen as British or English. And I said, I am Barbadian, so I'm going to, if I'm asked, that's what I say. Another thing I wanted to say, okay, I won't say that because she's asking about welcome, but generally, I made many friends in my social and work life. So that wasn't a problem, but I think having just chucked out the British and gained their independence, they wanted to assert themselves and say, just because you're English, don't think you're going to have it easy. But yeah, it didn't stop me having good relationships with them.
I think I was very welcomed by my husband's family and friends. To this day, I have very good friends that dated back to that time. But as Kalmita said, because you've just arrived, you don't know the environment, and then you look different, you speak differently, you carry yourself differently, you become Oyinbo. And actually, there's a phrase that your children often experience was ajebata. Ajebata means the children who are eating butter, you who eat butter on your bread. So you're an Oyinbo and your children are eating butter on the bread on your bread. So there's a distance between you often and some of the people whom you meet because you're ajebata and you're Oyinbo. And you don't have to, if you go into the market, you don't have to say anything. Unless you're with a friend, you will be Oyinbo, Oyinbo, Oyinbo. But
yes,
after some time, as Kalmita says, we know who we are. And no, I'm not Oyinbo, I'm not white. Yeah, my children eat butter when they have it.
Thank you. I think that ties into the second question in our Q&A from Joseph, who says, great discussion. I have learned a lot. How do you handle the challenges of resemblance by the time you are in Nigeria, when people who do not know you expect from what is expected of a Nigerian lady, and sometimes Nigerian can be very aggressive in making demands?
I'll tell you a little anecdote. I was in a boarding school which had a tuck shop, and this tuck shop was run by a lady whose first question to me was, can you cook soup for my brother? I said, yes, I cook soup. And she said, what about oha soup? I said, well, I cook soup. I put oha leaves in it. My family eat it. So I would say, I can cook oha soup. But she said, do you cut the leaves with a knife? I said, yes, I do. She said, then you can't say that you're doing it the correct way. You can't claim to know how to do it. And she was really angry. She said, traditionally, we just break the leaves with our fingers. I said, but I have a good knife. And I worked it out later that probably traditional knives would cause staining. So the tradition was to just break it. But she was so offended that I dared to cut these leaves with a knife. And in other instances too, there are ways of doing things. And as a newcomer, you dare not go left when the tradition is to go right. And you just learn to avoid friction by, avoiding the aggression that this question is referring to. Because, yes.
I think one of the things which can bring friction is you go to a relative, a distant relative. This is the wife, this is Miss Wife. She has come from England, America, wherever, but you don't know how to greet them. All right, you must greet formally. That is on your knees for a woman, for a man, a different sort of greeting, but still far down. And I remembered a friend of mine saying to me, the only person for whom I will kneel down is for God. Now you're living in Nigeria. If you get there and you get an old relative who's looking at you, you quickly learn it's very easy to do the proper greeting and avoid the aggression Kalmita is speaking about. The way you greet it. If if someone is handed you something, you take it with 2 hands and not with your left hand. You can't take it with your left hand alone. You have to take it with 2 hands. If you're giving someone something, the same thing. You have to hold it properly. So you quickly learn some of these little things that save you a lot of trouble and that aggression, right? And so that you don't get the reputation of being Oyibo who came from England and knows everything. And she's not going to be like us. We can't be like you, but we are who we are, but we can learn something from you. That was my attitude.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat as well. I know Itohan raised the previous question, but we have one from Jane who asks, is English the common language that all use? And I think she's referring to all the panelists.
Well, English is the official language in Nigeria. But as Denise was referring, if you want an easy life, you pick up a few words and phrases that are functional and help to get through the day. Me, as a teacher, there are young men who, who are now very respectful, their fathers themselves, but they're in touch with my sons and they always ask after me, but they would snigger at the way I pronounce, calling a register. It was a minefield. And one day a certain boy asked me, why do you call me Snake? I said, when did I do that? He said, my name is AK, and you call it AK. Slight nuances like that, which foreigner can't see, but you very quickly learn how to overcome this and pick up. I do wish I had done a crash course in at least one language though.
Yeah, in preparing to do field work, I did start studying Yoruba in New York, and then I continued studying in Nigeria. But it is a tonal language, and I was always very hesitant because, the same word could describe body parts and truck. And you know what word I'm talking about. And I was always afraid, terribly afraid of really saying the wrong thing. But still, and this is where I think living with Nigerian families helped me tremendously, because my comprehension was fairly decent at one point. And simple phrases I could get away with. But there were times when I was with Nigerians and say, if we got stopped by soldiers or something, they said, don't say anything. And that did happen. So, I like you were saying before, the 80s, and, I was there for Buhari's regime, Babangida's, and Abacha. And the military presence was so strong, and it's so arbitrary. Yeah, that I followed all the advice my friends gave me because I wanted to come home, and I did not want to get them harmed either.
I just want to jump in and say, I think, part of the any anxiety around, or I should say disappointment or anger, actually, that Mrs. Acha described around language and around West Indians, women, so-called inability to pronounce words in Nigerian languages the way they're supposed to be pronounced. I think that's actually maybe signaling a broader anxiety about, just an understandable anxiety really about transformations in, Nigerian just ways of being that, had been happening since, 19th century, 18th century, even before, right? And one of those transformations is a loss of language, loss of other forms of the loss of culture, right? So I think it's important to kind of keep it in that context. There are Nigerians who don't speak their so-called native or traditional languages, and it's not only the children of West Indians and Nigerians who are in this quandary. It has a lot to do with the colonial educational system that made speaking traditional languages, a crime. This kind of thing. So I think, maybe that anger kind of signaled difficulties dealing with these broader, really deep systemic, changes that, folks did not feel they had control over.
But to that point, I think some of what is behind it is that others think that you who have just come, you know better than they do, all right? And because of the colonial past, all right, you are another variation of that in the social context.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the two things can actually exist simultaneously, that the lashing out and the anger is actually a response to these larger changes. And also that, Nigerians, because of the particular historical moment that, West Indians are coming to Nigeria in, and we've established that actually goes back, quite significantly to the 19th century at least, that it was part of an assumption that really West Indians stood in for an extension of the colonial kind of regime. And there were other ways in which, through the economy, in which, Britain continued to have, a stranglehold over Nigerian affairs. And so I think we can see how these two things could actually be thought, simultaneously.
I think too that there are also sort of different, the time makes a difference. And so that generation that was there at the early part of the 20th century, they in some ways saw their role as helping to make, modern Nigerians, and in a sense, were supporting some of that cultural, some of the cultural elements that the British brought. So they didn't necessarily make an effort to learn the language. They didn't dress in local dress styles. And that, I think, is actually one of the differences between that generation, that particularly in the 20s and 30s, and those that started coming in the 1950s, because as they were coming as wives of Nigerian men, that there was a very different orientation towards being in Nigeria, and they weren't part of a broader colonial cultural project. And in some ways, I think we're much more open to really becoming, to a certain extent, embedded in Nigerian culture. They weren't part of the civilizing mission that I think the 19th century West Indians were, and to some extent, some of the ones who were there at the early part of the 20th century too. And so the generational differences, I think, were really significant and matter. And some of those aggressions that you may have experienced may have to do with the memory of those West Indians who were there as part of this larger cultural project.
Thank you so much. I believe that is all the questions from our audience. So I will hand back over to you, Judith and Idahan, if there's anything you would like to say before we wrap up today's history group.
I would just like to thank everyone for being here. I thank you to Mrs. Acha, Mrs. Osaimose, and Dr. Byfield, and the Barbados Museum and Historical Society for inviting us and allowing us to kind of join the conversation. There have been previous Zoom talks about migration, but I thought it was really important to add this more recent element that is particularly gendered in a different way, right? And to talk about women as bearers of Barbadian culture and, changers of history. So thank you for that opportunity.
Same thing. This has been such a treat. And I would love to talk to both of you some more.
Anytime.
And anyone in the audience who would also like to talk, definitely let me know. In fact, I will put my or actually maybe you can put my Natalie can put my email. I'm sorry, not Natalie, but put my email in the chat, and people can reach out to me. And I'm looking to do more interviews. This was so enlightening and so enriching. Thank you both so much.
Thank you. I'll ask Elena to drop it in the chat just while I wrap up, but thank you all for your very illuminating and engaging presentation. As I said, it's such a privilege to, discuss this part of your research with you, to hear these migration stories firsthand. And thank you to everybody who has attended, both here and on Facebook, for participating in today's session. And I'd also like to quickly thank my colleagues at the Barbados Museum for all their support in facilitating this event, particularly Kay Hall and Elena Pinder. And I hope everybody has a good afternoon/night. All right, and Judith's email is in the chat, so anybody who would like to contact her, please grab that as we're about to close the.
Please put my email in there too. I'm looking for photographs.
Oh.
What specifically are you looking for?
Photographs of homes or houses and gardens in particular.
In Nigeria.
In Nigeria. Yes, thank you.
Where Barbadian women were living.
Barbadian women, West Indian women.
West Indian. But there's something I just want to, an observation I want to make, which you researchers can look at. I think it just occurred to me, one of the reasons why sometimes you could feel there was an aggression against you was that many Nigerians thought that the relationship between a husband and a wife, this foreign woman and her brother, that he treated her differently, that it was not the same way he would treat a local person. I don't know if Carlmita sees that.
I understand.
Yes, and they felt like we had an advantage. You know, Oyinbo had the advantage with the husband that he wouldn't say or do certain things because we were outsiders or Oyinbo. And I think that could be somewhere in the back of some people's minds. Anyhow, that's your research question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thank
Something
you.
to mull over.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.